Morning people, welcome back to F Politics. About a year ago, I made a prediction about how the right would respond to the inevitable refugee crisis that would come as a result of what's happening in Palestine. The Tories will be saying that we can't let refugees from Gaza in because they might be Hamas. So their attack line will be, Labour wants to let terrorists into the UK. Now bear in mind, the Palestinians haven't actually had an election in Gaza for 17 years, and the average age in Gaza is 18, so none of them actually voted for Hamas. They're completely innocent in this. So the Tories are supporting the bombing and the ethnic cleansing of millions of innocent people, and will then paint them all as terrorists. And right-wing TV host Julia Hartley-Brewer is a perfect example of that, because not only did she take the position that Israel had no choice but to do what it's been doing.
If you think the Israeli response is unreasonable, disproportionate, it's wrong, what would be the right, proportionate, reasonable response to 1,400-year-old people being massacred? What would be acceptable to you for them to do, other than say, oh, well, never mind, we'll just carry on as usual, which is clearly not going to happen?
The UN's expert on this issue, Francesca Albanese, has already given the answer to that question.
Israel cannot claim the right of self-defense against a threat that emanates from the territory it occupies. What Israel was allowed to do, to act to reestablish law and order, to repel the attack, neutralize whomever was carrying out the attacks, and then proceed with law and order measures, meaning not waging a war.
But she also explicitly called for the entire Palestinian population to be simply removed from Gaza.
These people should be offered a new life elsewhere. Now, many may not want it, but this has actually been incredibly common. And of course, we've seen the ethnic cleansing of Jews and Christians in the Middle East without anyone batting an eyelid about that. Do you think that may be the answer?
So she effectively supported the complete obliteration of that entire territory and supported removing those people from that territory, thus creating the refugee crisis. And I predicted that that would then turn into, we can't take any refugees from Gaza because they might all be Hamas. Which brings us to today, with one Hamas supporting channel crosser being picked up by the authorities, and she says this about him.
We're just going to wait for the next attack.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to do. We're just going to wait for the next attack. And then when we have the attack, we're going to light some candles and we're going to pray. We're going to sing Don't Look Back in Anger, talk about community cohesion, and then we all move on to the next one. And that's what we do now, and that's what France does, and what Germany does, and Austria does, and Sweden does, and every other insane country that opened their doors to these people.
Sorry, I've got to add this because we need some perspective. The news talks about terrorism all the time, and that makes sense. It's serious, it's terrorism. But in the last 20 years, we've had about 100 lives lost because of terrorism in the UK. And the police say the fastest growing terror threat in the UK is right-wing extremism, which makes sense because we all saw last year the most widespread terror crisis the UK has seen in decades during the riots. And that terror crisis was created by the same politicians and journalists who constantly tell you that the main threat to us is brown people. And those same right-wing politicians and journalists are the same people who put an anti-expert Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, into Downing Street during a pandemic who cost tens of thousands of lives. And yet they want to push the idea that the main threat to us is brown people coming from abroad.
It's very unlikely he will actually be able to be returned to Gaza or anywhere else, because Home Office guidelines say they cannot return anyone to Gaza because it risks exposing them to, quote, serious harm, because conditions there are, quote, amount to torture or inhumane or degrading treatment under, guess what, the European Convention on Human Rights.
Hey Jules, why do you think the courts are saying that Gaza isn't safe? Could it be because of the atrocities that you've been supporting there? And yet she's still using her old rhetoric about how it's not that bad to live in Gaza.
Palestinian Abu Wadee, who left Gaza. Again, I thought we're told that Gaza was a prison.
Forgetting, of course, the countless crowdfunders that have been launched to try and help people to escape Gaza. According to the United Nations, 92% of the accommodation in Gaza has been hit by the Israeli attacks. So she is complaining about not being able to send people back to a country that she supported the destruction of. But she's going further than that.
I don't even think leaving the European Convention on Human Rights is going to be enough on this one, because we know that our insane tribunal judges are just going to overrule and just say, oh, well, I still think, my interpretation of the human rights law here. We're going to have a root and branch change. And it's something I know Lionel Shriver was talking about this on your Spike podcast on Friday. And she was saying, I think, this is what we actually have to abandon kind of the whole asylum system at this point. At some point, we're just like, this is not This is not something that is even viable anymore.
So for anybody keeping score, Julia Hartley-Brewer supported the atrocities that have destroyed 92% of the places that people can even live in Gaza. She explicitly called for the people of Gaza to be just moved elsewhere. And because some of the people who have been the victims of the atrocities that she supported have been radicalized by that, she is using that as a reason to not accept any refugees from Gaza. And yes, I am drawing a direct line of causation between politicians and journalists like Richard Tice and Julia Hartley-Brewer and the very radicalization that they say they're trying to protect us from. Because it's those politicians and journalists who've been pushing the narrative that anybody who opposes what Israel's been doing to Gaza for 18 months must be anti-Semitic. A narrative that has been heavily criticized by many Jewish people, including Holocaust survivors, because it implies that all Jewish people support the Israeli government's atrocities.
Netanyahu doesn't speak or act in my name.
And 15 members of my family have died in the Holocaust. And I find it insulting to the memory of Holocaust that it's being invoked as a justification by Netanyahu and the state of Israel and cover for the ongoing genocide in Gaza.
So what do you think it does to the odds of radicalization against Jewish people to be constantly told that all Jewish people want your country completely obliterated? Which is effectively the narrative of right-wing politicians in the UK and the Israeli government itself. So right-wing politicians, both here and in the Middle East, are creating a problem and then using that problem to justify the policies that they wanted to do anyway. And the UK side of that is exactly what I predicted would happen a year ago. And here we are. I'm Femi. Make sure you follow F Politics so politics doesn't F you. Have a great week.